big visual note-taking tool. So the whole like idea behind the chess pieces being representations for the enemies in the game is because it's exactly how they are in chess. In chess, for example, the pawn can only move one unit forward or two at the start, and they can only attack things diagonally in front of them. So, and that's why you have a bunch of them, because they're relatively weak and they have very minimal function. They don't do a whole lot. They're kind of stupid. So you abstract this idea of the pawn on the chessboard, and you can convert that into something for game design, and you think of the pawns are, you know, simple units, and they keep the player engaged so that you aren't running around in dead space. I'll launch a ROM here. And I officially own this game, so I can own a digital copy, so I'm not doing anything illegal here. I own Secret of Mana. This one. I think I have some cheats loaded too, that way I was able to just kind of run through the game, and because I was just using this as a way to like go around and look at stuff. I hope this isn't too loud, because I haven't actually done like gameplay stuff. So some of these creatures would be pretty strong pawns. Can't really see it because my guys are just kicking ass too much, but they're pretty simple. They just kind of walk at you. I'll tell my characters to stop. I'm basically going through these settings right now, and this was actually really cool to me. I'm gonna try and drop the sound down a little bit just in case. So this was on Super Nintendo, obviously, but you could actually control very basic AI for your character. You could have them be extremely aggressive, or you could have them be very defensive. So, you know, you could have them stay away and attack, that means they'd be ranged. You could have them approach and attack, that means they're melee. Or they could approach and guard, which means not a whole lot in this game, but it means they wouldn't attack much, and then if they keep away and guard, that means they'll pretty much just stay away and run. So you can see, now they're not fighting at all. Well, they will every now and then, but they aren't gonna be as crazy with attacking. So now I can talk about this wolf thing. These wolves are pretty basic units. They just kind of walk around. They don't really hurt you unless you get too close. They have some chase mechanics. So these are kind of like pawns for this era, and in Super Nintendo there wasn't a whole lot of extreme diversity in the kind of AI that they could write for things, so most things just kind of acted like pawns, where they just kind of mindlessly walk around and then attack you every now and then. So let's see here, what else can I pull up for? So that's enough for a pawn. Talk about what's the next one? A swarmer. No worries, you're not too late. I actually started at 4:30, so you're only about 10 minutes late. This was a very busy day. I needed that extra 30 minutes just to like eat something before I started streaming. I was just talking about units in games and why certain units work certain ways, and I just kind of explained the pawn, and now I was going to move on to a swarmer. So, a swarmer is obviously not a part of a chessboard, but usually what swarmers are is they're usually considered pawns in games, but in like Diablo, there is actually a difference between their pawns and their swarmers, and they actually have, I think they're actually called swarmers, or swarms in Diablo 3, to where I have this handy dandy little blank sheet that I can illustrate this stuff to you guys too. This will be a very interesting episode, very different from the rest, of course, because I'm just going to talk about game design. So if we have Anaya over here, oops. Okay. So we have Anaya here. You guys are pets. So, let's see, our pawn is just kind of like... Cool. What's up, Andy? So, as I said, a pawn, I'll just kind of illustrate it in the chess pieces too. So a pawn is kind of a stupid unit. It just kind of like will walk towards you, and then it'll just like attack, and then it'll kind of wander, and it might wander back and attack. Swarmers, on the other hand, is like tons and tons and tons of really weak units. And as I said, some games use them as pawns, or they use the pawns as the swarmers, but to me I think there's a different function to them. And the swarmers usually don't have like a wander in, attack and wander out, or wander off and come back and attack kind of mentality. They usually just go all ham. They're just like all in all the time, going at you crazy, like super aggressive. A really easy way to think of this is like disturbing a bee's nest, which is also why, you know, you could kind of think of bees or hornets or whatever also kind of pawns, because there are hornets by themselves that will kind of fly around and they'll annoy you, but then they'll fly off. But then if you go and you kick the freaking hornet's nest, you know, you're gonna have a bad time. So don't kick a hornet's nest. But this is basically what happens when you kick a hornet's nest, is they all just get super aggressive and they all charge you as fast as they can and attack you as much as they can. So while that can do a lot of damage and it applies a lot of pressure to the player, the main counter to it is to just be aggressive and fight it back. You can see I have this like strengths and weaknesses of them. So the weaknesses of swarmers is like AoE damage. You know, if you could summon in a fireball like this and it would blast a whole bunch of them, so that would take out like half the swarmers right there, and then you only have a couple more. Then you just summon down another one, hit those ones, and then you took out all those, and then you just have one crappy little swarmer here and you take care of it. Whereas and they all have really low health, so it's really easy to kill them that way. Whereas with a pawn, you know, you could hit them with an AoE spell, but they have more health, so it's like, what's the point of using an AoE spell? You could, but it's no better than doing something a little more direct. So there's just different design mentalities behind it. I'll just put a little note here. And I'll put this in its own layer. We'll talk about that for a sec. And so these like HP and damage things was just kind of notes to myself for when we eventually get to the point of making the creatures. Of how much damage I'd want them to do and how much I'd want them to take before they die. And we're thinking of very basic numbers. You can see like a boss has an HP of 30, and like rooks have a 5 to 10. And that's because I'm thinking way more like just a Zelda kind of way, where it's an action adventure and not so much an RPG where you're doing, you know, 20 or 30 damage per hit based off of your equipment, based off of the enemy's defense, blah blah blah. Whereas Zelda is just straight to the point, like you hit something and it dies in 2 hits, always. Or like when something hits you, you always take a certain amount of damage to your hearts. So these numbers are relative to something you would be accustomed to in a Zelda game, or like with Binding of Isaac. Binding of Isaac, of course, was directly influenced by Zelda. Like, the whole dungeon, it's exactly like a Zelda clone, except it's procedural. So yeah, that's my just own personal notes of things. And then strength of a pawn. They don't really have any strengths, but, you know, if there's a whole bunch of them and you ignore them, then yeah, they can become a problem. It's kind of the idea of like a single walking zombie. They're not much of a threat on their own, but they're a threat if you turn the corner and there's like 500 of them, and then you're basically going to get swarmed. Whereas with the swarmer, you know, they're always just going to be running at you, so you have to attack them. So enough about those two. The Rook is could be a tank. Usually is pretty tough, and they're usually also very aggressive, like a swarmer. So you think of like a football player, or like a really big knight. Like a gorilla. There we go. This is my cute gorilla. Such a friendly gorilla. I think that's cool. So anyways, like, a Rook would be something that's pretty tough. You know, you see like a big gorilla, especially relative to his size to Anaya's. He's kind of big, and you're like, whoa, that guy's buff. But they're usually not too smart, and they kind of just... They'll often do just like a charge attack. And they'll just kind of charge at you, and you can kind of dodge and roll out of the way. But they have a lot of health, so this is where it starts getting into why you would have certain enemies paired with other enemies to make the fight interesting. Because you wouldn't just want to create a play space that has a bunch of gorillas, because then you're just... Well, I mean, you could. There's always exceptions to the rule, blah, blah, you know. So yeah, you could have a bunch of gorillas and they're all charging you, and the whole point of it is to like dodge around a lot and try and kill the gorillas. But with this being balanced with the other ones, so you have this Rook who's kind of a tank. He has like 5 to 10 HP. I cherish. So he has like 5 to 10 HP, which relative to the other ones is like, you know, several of these, several of those. So he would take a while to actually kill. And the way that these work best is when you have knights, or what is labeled as a knight, which is usually the high DPS, and they can be either like archer range or like a caster that shoots fireballs, or they could be like a, you know, high melee damage like a ninja or samurai or whatever that runs up and like hits you really strong, and they're also mobile. So what this does is if you throw in the Rook with a couple of knights, here, let's have some like parrots. Keep the jungle theme going. That's an angry parrot. And the way every studio uses these terms would be different, so, you know, if you actually work at a large studio and you see this, then, you know, it won't be the same. So, as I was saying, the knight is the damage dealer. And you can use the example from Donkey Kong Country, well, I guess 1 and 2. There's parrots that actually will like spit eggs at you. So that's an example of someone that will do like a lot of damage with their attack, but they're ranged. And so what makes this fight engaging and difficult is you start adding a couple of knights So say you have like 3 birds, and those things are all chucking eggs at you. You're gonna have a hard time trying to damage the rook because he has so much health, while these things are chucking eggs at you. So this is where it starts to change the priority on the battlefield of what you should be fighting, and it's obvious that if you're trying to fight the rook, who has tons of health and is always going to be in your face, you're probably actually going to get killed by the knights that are spitting their eggs at you from ranged. So what a better strategy is to do your best to avoid the rook and go and engage the parrots who have considerably less health. You know, like a third of the health if, you know, these are just references. Say they have like, you know, a third of the health, so it's a better idea to run up and kill these high damage knight units before really dealing with the rook if possible. That way you can clear the battlefield of the hazards and the high damage that they output, and then while avoiding the rook. So then once you kill the knights, you can then kill the rook with much more safety, because you won't have to be avoiding him and avoiding all the egg-spitting parrot knights. And then the last one is the bishop. And the bishop is kind of the support dude. Support. Say like a little shaman or something. Up Supreme DDT. Yep. That's some kind of thing. So this is considered like the bishop unit. And so now what makes this even more challenging is the bishop, as you can see in the notes. The bishop doesn't really do any damage. Sure, they might throw a little something out every now and then, but it doesn't really do anything. Their main strength is aiding their allies and making them stronger. So you'll have the rook that's in your face, you'll have the knights that are trying to shoot you from range, and then you'll have the bishop in the back that's like casting shields on the units or something. Or increasing, like, giving this guy like a speed up ability. And he's also relatively weak. So he also becomes an extremely high priority target. Because now you have to avoid the rook, you have to avoid the eggs from the knights, you have to try and kill the knights because they're the ones that are going to be doing a lot of damage. But then you also are going to want to try to get to the bishop because he's the one that's making everyone else stronger. So it might be a good idea for you to just like dodge out of the way of the rook, dive way back into the back, take care of the bishop, and then start killing the knights, and then kill the rook. So I hope that's starting to kind of make sense of like the different kinds of units on the field and what they do, and then being able to create engaging fights around the world with that. And then the queen thing is just like a boss unit, and I won't get into that because boss fights are usually pretty unique. I think probably the best thing I would have to say about the queen or the boss fights is it's usually pretty cool to have a boss fight that has these other units participating, because so on this map you're going to be fighting these kinds of enemies in like 1, 2, and 3. My allergies are super freaking bad today. That's why I'm kind of like stop talking and stuff, because my head like starts feeling like that. So yeah, you have these 1, 2, and 3 zones, and aside from just having slightly more difficult pawns in each area, the pets, my idea is yes, like the idea is the Ember Pet will be more of like a Rook, like he's a little more tanky, which is why I have it called Ember and it's not Fire, because Ember means that there can be like stone and stuff involved. So that kind of makes you think like, okay, the Ember Pet is kind of tanky, so your Ember Pet will be like an in-your-face pet. And then that's also why I had these as birds, because Rang, the Storm Pet, will kind of be like the long-range damage dealer that'll shoot out like lightning strikes or like dive in and attack things. And then your Water Pet will pretty much be the Bishop, who can like heal or shield or speed you guys up, but he can also do a little bit of attacking. So yes, that's kind of the idea of it too. And then Anaya is kind of Anaya would actually kind of be like a pawn, because I wouldn't want Anaya herself to be able to do so much. Like, she'd kind of be like Link in the Zelda games, where she's able to kind of whack things, but that's about it. Which encourages the player to use the whole Rook Knight Bishop with your pets. And especially because they don't have hit points like Anaya does, they can take the damage. And if they, take enough damage to be unsummoned, she can resummon them into the fight. So this all sounds really complex, but it's not too complex. You just kind of design a character with something very specific in mind. Like, you would design a gorilla that has a lot of health, and you would make him mostly just charge you. And then he'd charge, and he'd kind of pause for a couple seconds, catch his breath, and then he'd charge you again. So beyond that, like, his design wouldn't be that complex. With the birds, you could have them kind of move around, and then if you get within range, they'll start chucking eggs at you, and then, that's about it. And then same with the bishop, might be a little more complex, because at least with like AI, you'd have to teach the bishop like which things to speed up, which things to shield. But really, like, the whole system individually is not complex. It's complex when you put them together into the playing field, which makes it interesting. But yeah, what I was going to say with the zones of 1, 2, and 3, you would be fighting probably a lot of pawns here, just so you would start to get familiar with the zone, familiar with like the pawns and what they do, and you probably have like maybe a rook here and there, a knight here and there, but you wouldn't have a whole lot. You'd probably just have like one gorilla in here, or the gorilla would be in the forest most likely. But anyways, you'd have like a big what I call alligilla. Actually, that's I'll pull that little sketch up. I actually called something an alligilla. That was the exact same thing that I had in mind. This guy right here, alligilla. So it's kind of like a gorilla, except he's like a big crocodile dude. So he would essentially be the rook for that zone, and you would only see him maybe once or twice in the first zone, because as I said, the whole purpose with the lower difficulty is to introduce the player to the zone. So the next zone is where we would probably have some swarmers, just to kind of break things up. You'd have some of the same pawns, and you'd have probably the same number of like rooks and knights, or maybe a little bit more, but you would start placing them in a way to where the combat is more difficult. And you can do that just with grouping. So let's say I had like 3 pawns in this little area. This is actually Anaya way down here. Kind of got her to scale. So let's say Anaya's up. Oops. Let's say you just enter the zone, and you're like right here. When you first enter the zone, you might see like a couple little pawns, and they're just kind of wandering around. You get up close to one, they'll be like, "Hey, what are you doing?" They'll bite you, and then they'll kind of walk away, and you'll be like, "Ow, that hurt." So then you kill it. So what would make Zone 2 more difficult is the grouping would be different. You wouldn't have 3 pawns together. You would maybe have like 2 pawns and a rook, or you would start doing like this here where I was explaining this. This is probably like a Zone 3 kind of thing. Like the most difficult for the area. Like the 5 out of 10 difficulty. So this place is where you would start getting into those complex fights, and you would have learned about the individual enemies in these previous zones, you would learn about the pawns, you would learn about the knights and rooks, and some swarmers, and maybe a bishop here or there. Or maybe you just reserve the bishops for this because they're an interesting addition to the difficulty and design for the fights. But this is where, since it's the highest difficulty, you would start combining things in an interesting way. Like, you would have your knights and your rook and your bishop, but then you'd also have a couple pawns walking around, and then maybe some swarmers come out of somewhere, so then you're like, you have to dodge enough to avoid the knights, you have to be aggressive enough to kill the swarmers, you have to be careful not to roll into a pawn because the pawn will bite you if you get close to it, all the while trying to avoid the rook and the knights while the bishop is buffing everything. So that's an example of an extremely, extremely hard fight. Just based off of combining the same units that were in the previous zones, but combining them better. So you wouldn't just fight like a whole bunch of pawns, you'd fight them in complex groups. That was a mouthful. I've been like talking non-stop for like 40 minutes. But as I said, like that's kind of a lot of what I had learned being at Sucker Punch and Bungie, and then just kind of watching the design process of how those companies, or you don't even have to have worked there, you just play the game. That's exactly what game design is you play the game, but you don't play it just to have fun and be like, that was cool, I'm done. Like, you play it with the mind of a designer and you think, okay, why is there a creature at this choke point? You know, someone put that creature there for a very specific reason. This is where I was saying, like, Dark Souls is a perfect example because they group their certain kinds of enemies in certain ways in certain spots to make that little section challenging. And then you get better and pass it once you have kind of learned how to avoid the attacks of one to reach the weaker ones in the back. So that's where I'm getting a lot of this information. It's just kind of like experience from playing games, thinking as a designer when you play like Dark Souls, and then just even as I was saying with like Bungie's games like Destiny, if you walk into a group of enemies, they have enemies that are tough, they have ones that are like shielding them, and then they have weaker ones that do a lot of damage. So it's really quite present in all well-designed games. So what I was going to do is I was going to segue that explanation of like why you group things a certain way into actually kind of putting those notes on paper for myself. Because this all sounds fine and dandy when I'm explaining it, but once I get in and I start designing things, you know, I'm not going to remember everything I'm saying right now. So it's best if I just I take my notes and then I visualize it, I put it on a map because I'm a very visual person, obviously. And then I can just refer to the map and be like, oh, I remember when I talked about this, and this is why I thought about grouping things in this way. And then with like these demon zones, because they're so high difficulty, I'm thinking of just throwing all that shit at you all at once, because that's basically the 3 areas before the end of the game. So anyways, I'm going to save this because it's actually kind of some good notes. I'm going to get a beer, so if you guys have a question about any of that, please ask, and then if there is a question, I'll answer it right when I get back.